again, welcome to the plenary session here. Today's Housing Summit has brought together and presented a whole bunch of various project challenges, partnerships, and resource opportunities, potential solutions, and a whole bunch of other items identified as being needed to be addressed as part of the housing solution for our region. Barriers remain: large lot size zoning and other regulatory layers, funding land, and funding development, creating sustainable development and sustainable development partnerships, as well as addressing environmental and permit challenges. This afternoon's discussion will use some specific project examples to hopefully tie together how these project items can work together and lead to a successful and financially viable project for low income, modified income housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. We have Stephen McDermott, Caleb Lincoln, and Emily Wassmer. They'll be presenting different aspects of the projects as we work through these examples, and there will be time for questions and answers. We will try to repeat the question for the recording. And with that, I'll turn it over to the group.
Will this work? If we put it here, we have to hold it up.
I think, yeah.
Okay.
Want me to hold it for you?
It's okay. Okay. So can we go to the next slide, please? Perfect. Thank you. So today we're going to kind of run through the process of creating an affordable housing project from start to finish, and then look at some scenarios at the end. So first, we're going to kind of hit the kind of key components for getting an affordable housing project underway. So first, we need to find a site, right? We need to see where we're going to do this, and what is going to fit on that site. Then we're going to look at our ownership structure, which can vary greatly depending on what you're trying to achieve, who you are, and then of course feasibility, and finally funding. Before we kind of get into each of these, I will say, and I think Stephen wants me to say, that this is not a step 1 through 4, right? And then you're done. This is a cycle that can feel Sisyphean sometimes, but hopefully you can break that and actually move forward. But it is very much a cycle that you often go back and repeat some steps as you refine what you're doing. So with that, let's. Thank you. Tell me if what I'm saying doesn't line up with what's behind me. So in our scenario, we have a town-owned lot. This is actually a lot that I own. This is a town-owned lot near a downtown with an unknown history. Right? There's a vacant lot near town. That looks pretty good. And the town has said, we want housing, so we're going to put an RFP out for development and see who comes forward and what they're proposing. I'm going to be the developer. I'm interested, and I have an idea. So with my idea, I would go, and so we've kind of, the site selection, this one is very easy, right? A site has been presented, there's an RFP. Basically, to get going, I would need to start doing some due diligence on the site, understanding what constraints the site has as far as zoning ordinance, right? Land use, what can I actually do here? Am I allowed to do the housing I want to do? And try to adjust and create a project that fits within that. And then, this is always where it's just always the scariest part to me right here. So we get into preliminary planning and design, which means we're starting to spend some real dollars, typically, to refine what we want to do as we get ready to go eventually to our local planning board, right? And as we're modeling all this out, funding is also going to be critical, right? As we kind of refine, we got to understand how our funding sources is. We probably came into this with some idea of how we were going to fund it, but in my experience, often there are other funding sources that need to come in, or there's a complete pivot. But so we're going through this process. And in this due diligence, we're going to do our necessary phase 1 and maybe a phase 2 would love to not do a phase two, but we might have to do a phase two in this example. I'm going to do my market research, even if I think it's a great.
Can you talk about what a phase one is really quickly?
I'm sorry. I was saving that for later. So these are environmental assessments. A phase one environmental assessment is a pretty low bar, doesn't cost a ton of money. You might even be able to go find some money out there to get it done for you. And a phase two is going to be a much more invasive process, which I think Emily is going to be our expert on a little later. So we've kind of done that. We've said, okay, we've done our hopefully just phase one, maybe phase two. And even if we thought we had a great idea for a housing project, we of course need to go do our market research. We need to go out. We need to understand what the market will bear, what are rents, what is the cost, how is this going to work? And I think that kind of actually blends nicely into the community needs and wants. I think it's really important, especially when we're talking about workforce, affordable housing, whatever we want to call it, that we engage our community early and frequently. That's the neighbors, that's town staff, that's a council member, right? It's just really making sure that you've heard what people are looking to do here. You'll probably still get a little opposition, most likely, but I think it's, it will help. And then finally, our occupancy type on this page. So I think that is, again, what are we trying to serve? All these things tie together. Did we hear from our community that 55 plus community is very underserved? And that's what we should be addressing. Is family housing the greatest need? Is luxury waterfront condos what everyone's hoping for? Probably not. Right, but making sure that we understand what the need is, who will be living in this, and building a funding model that works. And I think that's you now.
I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Caleb was right that I really wanted him to stress that this is not a linear process. And I've been trying to think of an analogy of what the development process looks like. And it's not really a puzzle and it's not a maze, because at different points you'll get different feedbacks that shape and shift how the project looks. And it comes into focus at different times and then maybe shifts back out of focus and you need to reassess. So on this slide, you'll see that there's continuing the pre-development, you're considering density and affordability. What is the density that the community will allow through zoning ordinances or not having zoning ordinances? Or what did you hear from the community when they talked about, we need some rental housing that can support young teachers, young professionals, or our aging community members? Or did they say, we really want small lot, single family home ownership? Those are different things and will guide how you develop that. When you think of affordability and when you get into housing, you'll quickly understand that there's 19 different definitions of affordable housing and whether they're talking with a lowercase a or a capital A. So when I think about affordable housing with a lowercase a, it means that the household is spending no more than 30% of their income on their housing costs. When I think of affordable housing with a capital A, those are programs typically that require you to limit who can move into the apartment or home, single-family home ownership project, limiting their income up to 80% of area median income, 100% area median income, 120% area median income, or 200% area median income. We heard about a program earlier. For some bigger programs, it's 30% area median income. So individuals who have very low incomes, maybe they're not working, they're on SSDI or SSI. We have 50% area median income serving many of our teachers, EMTs, firefighters, 60% area median income. So those are all things you'll want to consider. And if you say, we need rents at X level, that might preclude you from doing a capital A affordable housing project. Or you might say, get to a point later and you might say, our funding gap is so big, we need subsidy. And that subsidy is debt that you're not paying on, will allow you to will often require you to make your units affordable at a certain level. We then get to the site layout, and here's where we'll get to site layout then feeding back into density. If you have wetlands on part of your site, maybe you have 15 acres, so you can develop 150 units, but 13 of those acres are wetlands, or maybe need to be remediated in certain ways, so you can only use 2 acres or 1 acre, you're really going to limit how many units you can build that is allowed by that density there as well. Permitting is another challenge, and you might determine that we don't want to ask the municipality for any variances. We're okay, we can get the project done. Or you might need to say, we'd really like this type of variance. Maybe it is you want a little more density than what is allowed originally, or you might want to have less road frontage than 150 feet per unit. But that could trigger a different process, whether it's a code enforcement officer approval, shifting to planning board, whatever the local municipality might deem appropriate. And then infrastructure. Does the lot that we're talking about today in this example, does it have public water and public sewer brought to it? Or will you need to have private well and private wastewater? And all of those feedbacks might shape where you started when we were talking about density and affordability. By the time you get to infrastructure, you might go, whoa, we can't handle that. Let's refocus this project a bit. And, so there's a variety of different resources that developers can have access to develop their project. And if we break this out into public and private resources, and I'm going to try to stay out of acronym land, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. If I say an acronym, please raise your hand. That'll be good feedback to me to articulate what that is. So there's public sources. Public sources can provide financing. So Maine Housing, the state housing authority, can provide financing that is oftentimes below market rate, but they can also provide subsidy. But so can other local resources like municipalities or counties can provide subsidy. We saw when the American Rescue Plan Act came out, a lot of counties were making those dollars available to developers to allow for the development of affordable housing. We have tax credits. We both have the low-income housing tax credit administered by the IRS. We have the state low-income housing tax credit administered by the state of Maine. We have historic tax credits and state historic tax credits, so a variety of resources. Then there's other resources available through the Maine Office of Community Affairs, the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development, and those can either be used for infrastructure through the Community Development Block Grant, or for planning. Earlier was mentioned the Housing Opportunity Program, so helping conceptualize and reduce the barrier for developers to come into a community to build the type of housing that a community has already gone through the process of determining they need. We've talked about USDA, Department of Agriculture, Rural Development 515 program. There's some resources available there, and I'd love to talk about that in a bit. And then there's private investment, both from banks. We have local lenders like Machias Savings Bank, who often invest in housing or finances housing. And then we also have equity that developers can bring to the table. The public resources often close a gap between the cost of construction and what the developer might be able to repay, either through selling the homes or through the rents generated. So they help close the gap when the revenue will not be enough to fund the construction. Surprise.
So, yeah, this is a little shocking and does happen on projects sometimes. So in our scenario, on our example project site, based on the due diligence review, we determined that the vacant site used to be a gas station. So in this scenario, there may be buried tanks, there may be contaminated soil. So your project is probably going to need to change a little bit. But I do want to encourage everybody, don't walk away from a site just because there's contamination. There's still many possibilities to build an affordable housing project. So we haven't used the term brownfields yet. Brownfields, capital B, is a US EPA term. And what that means is property that is either known or suspected to be contaminated, and redevelopment or reuse may be precluded because of the actual or perceived contamination. So these are some typical concerns that we see at potentially contaminated sites and how we deal with those concerns. So construction workers might be exposed to the contamination during the actual build. We can control that and prevent negative health impacts by implementing health and safety plans, hiring trained workers, making sure that personal protective equipment is being used, things like Tyvek suits or dust masks. Another concern is that the future residents might be exposed to contamination once they're living in the occupied units. So oftentimes with redevelopment projects, we encourage that the cleanup is done in conjunction with redevelopment. So part of your site design could be an actual remediation type activity. So things like excavating hotspots and then backfilling with, maybe that's where your foundation may be. We can also consider doing things like installing a radon system that doubles as a vapor mitigation system so that vapors aren't entering the building and folks aren't breathing that in. The site design could also include cap and cover systems, which are essentially the same thing as landscaping or pavement to prevent contact with remaining contamination on site. Big concern would be higher construction costs. All of a sudden, you have to deal with this contamination. So with that, you could consider modifying the site design to reduce costs. So the soil that's generated, if it's contaminated, it costs a lot more to ship it off site than it would if it was quote unquote clean soil. So we could look at a project and potentially raise the grade or come up with some other ways to keep that soil on site instead of shipping it off site at cost. Funding gaps is a big one. So think about brownfields funding. Sunrise County has a brownfields program. There's assessment funding, which would potentially pay for the phase 1 or phase 2 and provide subgrants and loans for the cleanup activities. And again, the cleanup can be part of your redevelopment project, constructing the cap and cover systems. And I think we could talk about some other funding sources as well.
We can, and I think I want to highlight too, as Emily said, don't walk away. I'm familiar with a project in Norway where it was, they needed remediation from lead on a barn and a house that had been there, that was originally constructed in the 1870s. And when by the time they got to the demolition, they realized that all of that needed to be remediated. But what that did was they were able to access brownfields grants from the local administering agency. But that also then allowed them to have a clean site for a housing project. So they didn't have to include those costs in their housing project, which reduced their total development costs, which eased the burden on the renters. So what began as a really big challenge and something that this small team of really dedicated new developers saw as how do we overcome this? Actually in the end, created a clean site and reduced the cost of their housing development. Didn't reduce the cost of developing the site, but they were able to access grants for that as opposed to leveraging debt or subsidy that's supposed to go towards housing. So I think that's really important, that challenges within a project can become opportunity, although they might not seem like that when you're in the middle of them and trying to work through a voluntary remediation. But there are when we think about those other sources, you might have to pivot as a developer if you were trying to do this with traditional lending from a traditional finance institution. But if those construction costs or remediation costs drive that up, you may have said, we don't want to do capital A, affordable housing. We will do lowercase a. We won't have any covenants on it from an outside agency. But you may all of a sudden decide that, whoa, this added $500,000-$600,000 to our costs, or reduce the number of units we can put in. So we are going to opt in to those public funds, which come with a different regulatory environment, but make low cost, 0% debt or below market debt accessible to the project, making it feasible again. And that's part of the coming into and coming out of focus. And also one of the things I think we've been talking about, but maybe not explicitly, is the who is doing this. We've been saying the developer a lot, but your experience would be great here, but there's often a team of individuals and entities supporting the developer from the beginning. Developers come in with experience, vision, and a goal, but I don't know this, so I guess I shouldn't be so bold, but you're not an architect?
I am not an architect.
So you will need architects, engineers, lawyers, a finance team, you will need potentially a service provider if you're doing permanent supportive housing, like Safe Harbor, or you might need other team members that come in at different points. You might need TRC to come in and Emily join the team. And Emily would be, I think, would be upset if I didn't say this, as early as possible in the process to ensure that you have a good site and you are doing everything and not finding out that you have contaminated soils once an excavator goes in. But your team will change. So building a strong team around you while all of these complexities are coming in and making the project either more or less complex at any time doesn't mean that you have to know all of that. It is many hands that can make the projects work.
And I do want to speak to the last item here, public perception. So many projects have public challenges. You may or may not have public buy-in. If you're excavating contaminated soil, a lot of the time, neighbors are going to be concerned. That's understandable. So we need to think about how to communicate the information early and effectively in a manner that your everyday person would understand. And one of the project partners that I highly recommend bringing in on a contaminated site is Maine DEP and the EPA. They are there to help. They understand the science and can explain it to the public. And oftentimes on these projects, when you have public meetings, they'll be there right alongside you. We've also done things like develop project websites that have all of the environmental information there. It really should be an open line of communication throughout this entire process.
Okay, I have a quick question for you, Emily. What's the timing of the phase one brownfields assessment? Should you do that when you purchase the site, or should it be done as part of purchase and sales agreements?
So in order to maintain eligibility for brownfields cleanup funding, so there are multiple types of brownfields funding. There's assessment, cleanup, a few other types. But to be eligible for cleanup funding and to receive environmental liability protections, the phase one should be done within 6 months before your acquisition of the site. You may want to do it a little bit earlier so you can start to understand whether or not there are any environmental concerns. If you do it earlier, you will have to update it, but then you'll be able to plan for potential environmental costs.
Any other questions? Okay. Success story one.
Great. And I'm realizing we didn't do longer introductions. My name's Steve McDermott. I work for the Genesis Fund, an organization that for over 30 years has been providing financing and technical assistance to communities, developers, and others, individuals interested in housing across the state of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So, and thank you so much for having us here as you have this conversation. So the project I wanted to highlight today is Main View Apartments in Old Town, Maine. And there was some talk earlier about RD 515, which is Rural Development 515 program, which was a tool used to finance the development and construction of housing through the late 1900s, sorry, not 90s. And this project, I think, is really interesting and speaks to some of the opportunities that are facing us. And I think so much of the conversation recently has been framed in what are the challenges. And on the other side of challenge is opportunity. We have more resources in the state of Maine coming in to support the development and preservation of housing. And that's really important to notice. We aren't going to develop our way out of this. We cannot lose the housing stock that we have. So thinking around those challenges will be really important. So this project, apartment building, was a 24-unit rental apartment building that was originally built in 1914 as a schoolhouse, then converted in 1988 through the RD 515 program into 24 units of affordable rental housing with rental assistance associated with each of those units, which is really important. We've talked about what that means to the households. It ensures that they pay no more than 30% of their income towards housing. So not only after being income qualified, the resource helps ensure that they are not housing burdened. The transfer so one of the things that Genesis can do is we are contracted by USDA RD to provide technical assistance to current RD 515 owners to help transfer those properties to nonprofit entities who will continue to own them and operate them as capital A, capital H affordable housing in the community. What we are seeing is, as was pointed out earlier, is a number of these projects are aging out of their original financing. And at that point, they can become market rate units and they lose their rental assistance. So we really want to keep those projects in the portfolio. So if you know nonprofits who are interested in developing housing or developing more housing, I'd love to connect with you. So this project was transferred to a nonprofit owner. It generated over $1 million in resources to pay for. You're okay. So I mentioned, right, it generated over $1 million that was identified for the capital needs assessment to bring the units back up to be high quality, sustainable housing that our neighbors can be proud of living in. It leveraged some really great resources. So it transferred the existing RD note to the new owner, amortized it, which is a fancy term for calculated how much it would cost to pay for over another 50 years. It leveraged the state low-income housing tax credit, which was just renewed by this legislature, which has a set aside to ensure projects like this get awarded the credits, which generates equity. It leveraged community development block grant funds, and it leveraged a loan from Genesis, but other CDFIs can provide lending here, a below-market loan to ensure that this project remains affordable, high quality, accessible, and safe. So I want to highlight the challenge facing us that Charles highlighted earlier this morning in the opening. There's opportunities and resources. And part of our job at Genesis is to support nonprofits and owners to connect and make these transfers happen.
So this is a project that I did in Rockport, Maine, 7 Madden Lane. And I think hearing Stephen, what's interesting is the difference in funding sources, I think, that we see here. Like, there was a lot of established programming there. Call Genesis, they're amazing. They'll walk you through that. But it's a lot to take on, right? It's like a lot for someone to kind of wrap their head around if they're starting out. My head's spinning. And so what this one did that was interesting, and this was pretty early on, not that long ago, but kind of when I got started. So there was this vacant office building. What's the healthcare provider here? Is it primary healthcare provider, major one? Are you Northern Lights? Down East Community. So, okay, so we have Maine Health. Maybe these guys did the same thing. Maine Health really consolidated, right? They had all these kind of small office buildings scattered around, and they came in and they're like, no, we're bringing everything into our main campus. This, everyone remembers as the physicians building in Rockport. Like, everyone's kid had their checkup here. And it's at vacant. They consolidated. This kind of just sat there. And people were trying to figure out what to do with it. So we came along, and there was actually an owner after Maine Health. An individual bought it to try to figure out what to do. And so approached him and basically said, I think we could do a housing project here. But I was pretty new and probably couldn't have swung like a LIHTC and all these things yet. So we looked, and there was this rural affordable rental housing program through the state of Maine, which is up to 18 units. It's 2 different types of debt. It's pretty easy to wrap your mind out around. One is a paying debt. One is a 0 interest, no payment, deferred debt for 45 years, right? So it kind of just sits there in the background. And it makes these things theoretically pencil. So we had that. But to also make this work, I couldn't pay market rate for this building. So we had an owner who was really invested in seeing housing created here in their community. They said, okay, well, what can you pay me for the building? And I said, I can pay you a number. And he's like, okay, well, that's less than half of what I paid for the building, so that sucks. But he wanted it to work, so we got there. We had that happen, and we were moving forward, and we still had a small gap, right? It still just wasn't quite working. And actually, this is where Genesis comes into the story. I forgot about this. There was a nonprofit in our community that was kind of getting started that wanted to support housing, was trying to figure out how. And so approached them and said, hey, I have this project. I think it's going to be great. But there's this little gap. Can we figure this out? And they said, okay, yes. And actually I contacted Genesis, said, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm a for-profit developer. I'm trying to get this nonprofit money into my project, but I don't want tax consequences for me. Like, how does this work? And Genesis was like, oh, well, your 80% area median income in the whole project actually fits, with our mission. We can, if they give us the money, it can be a restricted grant to us and we can extend a zero interest loan to you. So we worked with Genesis. We got that money into this project, rounding out our capital stack, and it moved forward. And that project finished actually in April of this year. So it's on Route 1, there was water and sewer. It's 18 units, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom, a bunch of families. And Camden Rockport has a declining enrollment in their schools. So a really big thing for me in this project, I felt like just a huge win that 6 households had children that were either able to stay in the district or actually moved into the district, which was really significant. But yeah, just to me, this was a great example of existing infrastructure that isn't huge, not a huge footprint, that's kind of just around, not terribly dilapidated yet, but heading that direction and figuring out a way to revitalize it. So, yeah.
So my project example here is the former snow school in Freiburg. This was an aging school. There were 2 different buildings. One was historic and the hope was to save it, but it was vacant for quite a long time. And unfortunately that wasn't possible. With this project, the town had acquired the site from the school district. And Avesta purchased the site from the town in 2019, again, originally intending to save that building. But through this, through a different regional entity's brownfields assessment program, we reviewed the information for the site, did some sampling, discovered that there was a heating oil tank still in the ground that required removal. And the old buildings had asbestos, lead paint, and PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls, which are often found in older window caulking, things of that nature. And there was lead contaminated soil around the larger building. So the existing buildings, again, were demolished. The cleanup was completed in conjunction with redevelopment. And this new building was constructed with 28 units of affordable senior housing, and it became occupied in 2024. The funding sources were brownfields assessment funds, brownfields cleanup, low-income housing tax credits, and a construction loan. And I do just want to point out that this probably isn't something that you would typically think of as a brownfield site. This is an old school. Brownfields funding can be used on a wide variety of sites. So before you go into a project, just ask the question, contact Jen Peters. We can talk to you about this. If you have no information for a site, that might be a reason to do a phase 1 ESA and figure out what had been there. We could think about old dilapidated buildings that the town has acquired through tax foreclosure or through other means. Those are potentially eligible as well. So keep your mind open. Don't hesitate to reach out for funding. Similar to Stephen and the Genesis Fund, TRC provides technical assistance. It's no cost to you. So pick up the phone. We're happy to help.
Want to take us home? Do it. It's all you.
I've said this 3 times, I think. Development is complicated and nonlinear. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. You don't need to do it alone. There are a lot of people with vast amounts of experience that can support you along the way, both individuals and entities that have very formal roles in supporting the development of housing. But I'd also say if you looked around this room, there's a wealth of information both related to what is happening in community, what community would like to see, what has happened in the past, what has been successful, what may have been a harder route, and what might be an easier pathway, or what are the conversations that need to take place within the community so that when somebody with a housing project shows up, it's welcome and received well. And then there are also organizations like TRC, developers or engineers, architects, lawyers, finance professionals, individuals at the Genesis Fund that can help you in more formal ways to move development forward. Be creative. I think Emily's highlighted a couple of really important reasons why you want to be thinking broadly about what your project is, can be, or what it might have been before, and what it looks like going forward. Expect the unexpected. Things are going to pop up. Opportunities are going to pop up. Foundations that want to support your mission are going to be really important, but opportunities with local officials, community members who are going to be interested, school districts who might be supportive. We often, we've heard about volunteer fire departments losing members of their cadre, and how do we sustain our communities and help our more rural communities stay safe? There's all different types of need, and housing is a foundational need to our communities. So how do we start having those conversations that move them forward? And I guess the last thing I'd say is resilience is really important through this as well. So if I'm saying all of these things, like just keep up and be chipper the whole time when you're faced with a brownfield and then a gap and then vote, ongoing planning board conversations, or your financing isn't approved. But when these are all things that have happened, and when you have your team to lean on, whether that's your friends or the consultants or your partners, they've likely experienced something similar and can help buoy you through those challenging times.
Okay, and with that, I think another way to summarize it is you need a project champion, somebody that's going to win and act towards the final solution of all these challenges that come up, and make sure your viable projects makes its way through construction onto occupancy. So are there any questions from the crowd? Any outstanding? Jen?
Out on the resource table up front, there are copies of SCEC's Brownfields Assessment Program, information about that for phase 1, phase 2 assessment. So we have one of those on the way out if you can think of anything. But for a project, of any size like this. So Caleb, were you born a developer, or did you go to developer? Even get into that, because we don't have a lot of folks here who are using the title developer.
Yeah. No, I worked in robotics until like 5 years ago, maybe. Yeah, I was totally not my world. So I came to development as someone that needed housing. I wanted to move back to my hometown. And there was a job that I was interested in there. It was just a small job, but I was passionate about it. But housing was outrageous, and I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out how to pay rent, or let alone buy a house. So I actually lived over my parents' garage for a while, and I saved all the money I could to do the first-time homebuyers program and bought a 3-unit building. And I lived in the basement apartment and rented the other 2. And it really opened my eyes to just the challenges, right? I was kind of living that, but at the same time, it was really making me aware of kind of the rental market, the need for housing, how many other people were in my exact situation. So that kind of got me down the road. And then when I really got serious about this, it was because I was very passionate about revitalizing downtowns. Right, that was really one of my focuses, and I saw just so much underutilized infrastructure in our town. I was like, well, it'd be nice if this were more vibrant, and people need a place to live. So can we figure out a way to bring those two things together? And actually, that first one was a massive miss for me, but in the end, it had a happy story. I came back to it about a year later and got it done. But no, there was no formal training or background. It's funny, I talked to this group of high school kids a while ago, and what I said to them maybe seems relevant now. Is just just do something. If you're passionate about it, try to make some small action. If you're at the if you're in a community, try to see if you can get the wastewater fee reduced for a developer, right? It's just a little thing. Or I don't know, I learned a lot of places don't have zoning, but see if you can amend zoning. Or if see a building that is interesting, see if there's a other community members that share that vision and maybe talk to an employer to see if they would get a master lease, right? And like rent those units for like 5 years from you, making it more bankable. Like just try to do that's not a very small thing. That's a big thing. That last one I just said I recognize, but like I found that like I just started trying to act and then I picked up my phone and called Genesis. I didn't know Emily before this. I might have called her though too, but I just like unabashedly called everyone I could and asked so many questions. And I basically was probably the dumbest person in real estate development for quite a few years, but like kind of turned a little bit of a corner. Maybe I'm still the dumbest. But it was really just a lot of trying to learn, being passionate, calling, getting all the support I can, and just being like so scrappy, like just looking for me. To this day, like last week I was on the phone because I learned there might still be ARPA funds in that county commissioner administrators have that are unspent and expired at the end of this year. I'm picking up my phone and cold calling those county administrators to see if I could possibly have any of that funding to do a housing project anywhere in the state. Like just trying. Yeah.
Okay, no other questions?
Yeah. You started to list, Caleb, a few ways that, small ways, everybody can hear me generate. Oh, sorry. Oh, Caleb, okay, a moment ago, you alluded to some small things that individuals or a community can do to attract a developer. There's got to be more.
Oh, yes.
Okay. We've only got the whole hour though, but
no, yeah. I touched on this in an earlier session, and I do think that's a really important thing. Like my point then was, developers have limited resources just like everyone else, and both time and financial resources. So we don't want to really go into it. It's hard to go into community if there appears to be some resistance. So at a municipal level, there's small things like I mentioned, like various fees and trying to reduce some building permits. Can you reduce those for a developer? Can you take a step bigger and say, we're going to create a TIF district, an affordable housing TIF district, right? Kind of in an area that makes sense for us. Do we have a downtown that's old enough to be on the historic registry? Could we go through the process of making sure it's on that to open up all that additional funding for that developer, right? Have we organized our zoning in a way that shows a developer that we do kind of want them there, right? Created kind of that downtown, close to downtown center density that allows development to happen. And beyond that, I think if like a developer comes, I've found it's very beneficial if people, whether paid employees, part-time employees, volunteers, just your town select board, anyone someone speaks to, is just that there's some consistency in the message that is being sent to a developer. It's always very discouraging if you get in and a town manager's like, oh my God, yeah, we love this. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna spend a little bit of money and figure this out. And then you hit planning board, or you might hit your select board and they're like, we hate you, go away. That is just right. It's like, oh, okay, like the development community in Maine is small, right? That message gets around pretty quickly if you hit those walls. The caveat to all that, I will say, is I'm a developer and I will take every penny you will give me. So it is important, I think, that municipalities also kind of somewhat have a familiarity with kind of the funding sources available and like some familiarity with development in general. So when I come asking for money, you're able to look at my project and make sure I do need that money, right? Because your money's finite just like everyone else's, right? You don't necessarily want to just hand me a bunch of money and line my pocket. You want that money to spread around to as many projects as you can. I see municipalities sometimes not being taken advantage of, but right, the ask comes out and there isn't necessarily the education on the other side to vet that ask. I think it's important.
How about assessing and cleaning up a property for you?
Oh, I love that. That's the other thing that you can do. This is a little bit bigger, but a really powerful thing that you can do is a municipally owned, not a tax repossessed, which I'm learning all about, and it seems like a nightmare. You gotta, yeah. Let's skip that. So let's say you got some property, right? A really powerful thing you can do is actually just tee that up for a developer. So I will use a specific example. These guys, if they want to have a broader response, they certainly can. But for me, a project that was very successful recently is, which we pulled from here, we used in this presentation, is the city of Rockland owned a site that needed brownfield remediation. They'd owned it for a while. It was a junkyard. And they put it out to RFP and they said, okay, we want affordable home ownership on this site. So up to 120% AMI. We want that. We are willing to give this land basically to a developer, and we're going to do the cleanup for you. We've gotten the grant, so we're going to do it. You're going to have a prepped site ready to go. Does anyone want it? So responded, got the project. And the city actually was able to go one step further. We worked really closely together to really define what this housing project was going to be. And so there's some money at risk for me. There's a lot of trust that, they weren't, something weird was going to happen. They were going to try to take this out from under me. So I spent some money defining what my project was going to be, the sites, the housing locations, to allow them to reduce the amount of excavation they needed to do of contaminated fill, saving money in the grant, which then they turned around actually use those dollars to do the infrastructure for the houses I need. So they stubbed in water, they stubbed in sewer, they actually did underground conduit for electrical as well. So they saved me, I don't know, $30,000 a lot or something, making that project just so much more viable. And it was like just such an indication to me, like even from the RFP, like, okay, I'm looking around, I know what you want from me. There's no ambiguity. You're asking me for this, and I'm going to see if I can deliver on that. It was really wonderful to be part of. Is that right? Anything else?
I think I don't know if there's anything else, but to take it a step back from that, what I hear Caleb talking about is a municipality or community that had made clear its priorities and what it needed. So I think sometimes that is a low cost. Sometimes you hire a facilitator to have those conversations, but it sounds like in that instance, the community had identified what its priorities were and what assets it had to bring to the table and did not have to become a housing developer. They were able to say, we'd like this to happen. What can we do? Leverage experience and expertise and resources that allowed them to meet the needs of their community, probably multiple, again, thinking about school systems, downsizing smaller household sizes, meeting needs of community, but they didn't have to meet the need. They had to identify what a priority was, what their priority was, and allow somebody to come in, which then makes it easier for the developer to come in and say, okay, I can do this. Here's what I need to do. They can start developing their pro forma and figuring out what are the sources that they need. Maybe you can do this with equity, or maybe you'll need to look for programs for timing from Maine Housing or other funders, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston's Affordable Home Ownership Housing Program. So those taking the time to establish their priorities and needs allowed the project to move forward, clearly meeting the community's needs without having to incur additional cost, while also likely generating more tax base for the community.
On the brownfields funding side, so there are cleanup grants and there are cleanup loans. Municipalities and nonprofits are eligible for grants. For-profits are only eligible for loans. So oftentimes, if a municipality can tee up a site, as Caleb said, get everything they can get done through that grant funding, there may still be some cleanup left, and the developer could take on a loan, a low interest loan through the brownfields program, but the municipality has the ability to do whatever they think needs to get done to prepare the site for development. And oftentimes that can be, $500,000 or more, and that's a big nut.
Microphone, I'm sorry.
And Blake, can you mention possible planning for redevelopment and community outreach through the Brownfields program as well?
Yes. So the Brownfields program, the assessment grant that Sunrise County has, also offers redevelopment planning. So beyond just collecting samples and doing cleanup work, The program can actually look at a site or a specific area and help either the municipality or a developer envision what the site could become. So we can do things like develop conceptual site plans, review all of the zoning and other municipal requirements to figure out what could go on this site or in this corridor. We've also done things like hotel studies. So we can look at an area, a county, and identify a few brownfield sites and other sites, non-brownfields, that might be a good location for a hotel. And we can gather information that the hotel developers may need to review in order to site the hotel. With Cherryfield Town Square, currently we are helping do a septic evaluation to figure out if the septic system needs to be replaced or upgraded as part of the redevelopment there. So if there's a need, just ask. We can try and make things work. Something else I'll mention too is we do things in the waterways as well. So we can do things like supporting evaluations for dredging or waterfront piers and the rehabilitation of whatever infrastructure may be in need of repair. So just ask.